The mist was less a weather phenomenon and more a physical presence here, a cold, damp shroud pressing down on the narrow track. Elias adjusted the heavy wool collar of his coat, the rough fabric scratching his chin. The air tasted of wet stone and something else, something sharp and metallic that settled on the back of his tongue like old blood. Ahead, barely visible through the swirling gray, were the first signs of the village, squat, dark shapes huddled together against the slope of the mountain. Lumia Utata. The Forgotten World. The name felt less like a label and more like a prophecy. He checked the compass strapped to his wrist, though he knew the magnetic north here was wildly unreliable, prone to strange fluctuations near what the locals, in their few, terrified reports, called the bleeding stone. His real guide was the low thrumming beneath his boots, a subtle vibration in the earth that grew stronger the closer he got. It wasn't geological, it felt rhythmic. And wrong. Rule 4, log all sensory input, no matter how minor. The taste, the smell, the unnatural vibration. Each piece could be a key. Or a trap. He'd been on assignment for the archive for 12 years, seen things that would shatter a weaker mind, filed reports on anomalies that defied physics and sanity. But Lumia Utata had stopped reporting altogether 3 weeks ago. Not a single signal, no courier reaching the nearest town 50 kilometers away over treacherous mountain paths. Just silence. And the silence itself was a report, a screaming red flag in the archive system. The first house loomed out of the mist, its windows dark, like vacant eye sockets. Plaster peeled from the walls, revealing ancient, weathered timber beneath. A symbol, crudely carved, marked the doorframe, a jagged spiral within a broken circle. Elias recognized it from the preliminary files. A protective ward, meant to keep something out. Or perhaps, to keep something in. He walked deeper into the village. The silence wasn't just the absence of noise, it was an active entity, heavy and suffocating. No dogs barked, no chickens scratched in yards, no faint murmur of voices or distant ring of a hammer. Only the soft, squelching sound of his own boots on the muddy track and the persistent, unsettling thrum from the ground. Rule 7, assume hostility until proven otherwise. In places like this, the absence of life often signified something far worse than emptiness. He passed a small fountain in the village square. The stone basin was cracked and dry, filled with dead leaves and grime. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to touch the rough stone, to run his hand over the carvings on its base. He suppressed it immediately. Rule 1, never allow the earth here to touch your bare skin. The vibration was strongest near the ground, emanating from the soil itself. He kept his hands shoved deep in his pockets, gloves thick and impermeable. The church stood at the far end of the square, slightly elevated, its spired bell tower piercing the mist like a skeletal finger. Its bells, usually a source of comfort in such isolated communities, were silent. He checked his watch. Late afternoon. The sun, a pale, diffused disk behind the mist, was beginning its descent. He had maybe an hour, 2 at most, before full dark. Rule 2, never stay within audible range of the church bells between midnight and dawn. This rule was perplexing because the bells hadn't rung in weeks according to the last reports. But the archive's rules were rarely based on current circumstances alone. They were distilled from centuries of terrible experience. Maybe the silence was just temporary. Or maybe it wasn't the bells themselves that were the danger, but whatever force prevented them from ringing. He approached the church slowly, his hand resting inside his coat, near the grip of the modified flare gun loaded with silver nitrate rounds, standard issue for certain types of anomaly. It wasn't much, but sometimes a sudden, intense burst of light and energy could disrupt things. The heavy wooden doors of the church were slightly ajar, groaning faintly in the imperceptible breeze. A thin, black stream oozed from beneath them, staining the stone steps. It looked like water mixed with soil, thick and dark, but it smelled utterly foul, like something that had been dead for a very long time, left to rot in warm earth. It also carried that same metallic tang as the air. He hesitated at the foot of the steps. Entering was the logical next step for investigation. But every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to get away from the smell, from the palpable sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the dark gap in the doors. Rule 11: if your instincts scream danger, listen. Unless overridden by a higher priority rule or direct order. His orders were simple: investigate the silence, report on the anomaly. Entry seemed necessary for that. But the smell, it felt like a warning, a boundary marker. He drew a small, tarnished silver crucifix from his inner pocket, holding it loosely. It wasn't a religious act. Silver was effective against certain types of energies. A tool, like the flare gun. He pushed the door open a little further. The interior of the church was dim, illuminated only by the weak light filtering through the misted windows and the open door. The air inside was colder than outside, still and heavy. Dust motes danced in the faint light shafts. The pews were empty, lined up in neat rows. The altar was draped in a heavy, dark cloth, something lumpy beneath it. And the smell was overwhelming here, thick and cloying. It wasn't just rot anymore. There was an undertone of something else, something fungal, and wet, and moving. And the thrumming from the earth felt stronger now, vibrating up through the stone floor, into his bones. He took a cautious step inside, his boot scuffing against something soft on the floor. He looked down. It was earth. Not just dirt tracked in, but a patch of dark, rich soil spreading across the flagstones, snaking towards the altar like slow, dark veins. It was damp, almost muddy, and seemed to pulsate faintly in time with the vibration from below. Rule 1: never allow the earth here to touch your bare skin. The rule resonated in his mind, cold and absolute. He carefully lifted his boot, stepping around the encroaching soil, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the church, the high, shadowed ceiling. The silence here was different too, deeper, more profound. It felt like the air was holding its breath, waiting for him. And then he saw it. Behind the altar, partially obscured by the dark cloth, a single, bare foot protruded. It was coated in mud, unnaturally pale, and utterly still. It belonged to whatever was hidden beneath the cloth. His breath hitched. The source of the silence? The object of the anomaly? He took another careful step forward, avoiding the spreading earth, towards the altar, towards the lumpy shape beneath the cloth, towards the cold, still foot. The thrumming intensified. The old woman's eyes, milky and unervingly still, fixed on mine, and a chill that had nothing to do with the Siberian wind snaked down my spine. Her gaze wasn't accusatory, not angry, but held an ancient, knowing depth that seemed to peer right through me, dissecting layers of my being I wasn't even aware existed. Her face, a roadmap etched by brutal winters and forgotten summers, remained impassive, only the unsettling stillness of her eyes betraying any hint of consciousness or emotion. She sat hunched on a low stool just inside the doorway of a small, crumbling izba, framed by rough-hewn logs that looked centuries old and a thick, faded patchwork curtain attempting, futilely, to keep the biting cold out. The air around her was heavy and still, thick with the smell of damp earth, old wood smoke, and something else entirely, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old, dried blood or the cloying scent of decay. I stood frozen, the biting wind whipping around me, carrying flakes of snow that stung my exposed cheeks. My breath plumed in ragged bursts. I wanted to speak, to ask for directions, for shelter, for anything that would break this suffocating silence and the terrible weight of her stare. But the words caught in my throat, choked off by a sudden, primal fear that had seized me the moment I met her eyes. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the mournful whistling of the wind outside and the faint, almost imperceptible creak of the old woman's stool as she shifted slightly, if indeed she shifted at all. I felt utterly exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't anticipated when I'd set out to find this lost village. Miles from the nearest road, disconnected from the modern world by distance and by something far more profound, I was an alien presence in a place that felt utterly, aggressively unwelcoming. The houses around me were hunched and dark, snowdrifts piled against their walls like sleeping, misshapen beasts. No light showed in any window, despite the encroaching dusk that bled across the gray sky. Why had I come here? Curiosity about lost villages, archaic beliefs, and forgotten ways felt stupid now, a naive, academic impulse that had led me directly into the path of something I didn't understand and certainly wasn't equipped to handle. This wasn't picturesque or charming, it was desolate, decaying, and intensely watchful. The woman hadn't moved beyond that almost imperceptible shift. She hadn't blinked. Her gaze felt like a physical weight pressing down on me, trapping me in the swirling snow. Was she blind? I leaned slightly, a nervous, involuntary movement. No, the way her eyes seemed to follow the subtle shift of my weight, the slight turn of my head, suggested a form of sight, albeit a strange, detached, almost predatory kind. It was the sight of something that saw not just the surface, but the currents beneath, the fear coiling in my gut, the foreignness of my soul. The village of Ozerki felt less like a place where people lived and more like a collection of decaying husks left behind after some terrible, forgotten exodus. The deep snow muffled most sounds, creating an eerie, unnatural silence that seemed to amplify the few noises that managed to break through, the mournful wind, the distant, phantom groan of settling timber somewhere deep within the village's core. Twisted, skeletal trees, stripped bare by the harsh climate, clawed at the bruised gray sky on the horizon, their branches like skeletal fingers. Each isba seemed to sag under the unbearable weight of countless years and relentless neglect, their small, dark windows like empty, staring eyes looking out at nothing, or perhaps something I couldn't see. A few figures, heavily bundled against the cold in dark, shapeless layers, moved slowly in the distance, almost like shadows detaching themselves from the gloom, disappearing behind corners of buildings before I could get a good look at them, their movements too slow, too deliberate. I remembered reading about places like this, isolated settlements clinging to existence in the harsh corners of the world, steeped in old ways that predated recorded history. Places where the veil between our world and others was said to be thin, permeable. Superstitions about nature spirits, mischievous house sprites the domovoi, malevolent forest demons the leshi, and things far older and darker were not mere folklore here, but lived reality, woven into the fabric of daily life like the rough thread of their traditional clothes. The way the villagers avoided eye contact when I'd passed the few I'd seen earlier, the strange, angular symbols carved into doorframes and window frames, ostensibly for protection but radiating a palpable sense of unease, it all pointed to a deep-seated fear, a constant, weary appeasement of unseen forces that held sway over their lives. And the old woman, could she be one of the village's wise women, a keeper of ancient knowledge? Or something else entirely? The grotesque, unbidden thought of Baba Yaga, the terrifying witch of Slavic folklore, sprang from my readings and lodged itself in my mind like a splinter of ice. As I stood there, frozen in the biting wind and the suffocating silence, the old woman slowly, deliberately, raised a gnarled hand. Her finger, crooked and stained with earth or something darker, pointed past me, down the narrow, snow-choked lane towards the apparent center of the village. She didn't speak. Her lips remained a thin, colorless line in her wrinkled face. But the message was clear, unmistakable, go that way. And implicit in the silent command, radiating from her like heat from a dying fire, was the other message, get away from me. The air directly around her seemed to grow colder, heavier, pressing down on me, stealing my breath. The faint metallic smell I had noticed earlier seemed to intensify now, cloying and sickening. As my gaze dropped from her face for a moment, I noticed a small, dark stain on the packed earth floor near the woman's stool, partially obscured by a scattering of straw. It was dark and viscous, shimmering faintly in the dim light. It looked wet. A fresh wave of nausea and fear washed over me, causing a shiver to run through my entire body. The silence wasn't empty, it felt full, vibrating with unseen listening things. The wind seemed to carry whispers that weren't wind at all, low, guttural sounds just at the edge of hearing, impossible to decipher but deeply unsettling. I backed away slowly, carefully, keeping my eyes fixed on the old woman in the doorway. She didn't lower her hand until I had taken several steps back. Only then did she retreat slightly into the dark interior of the izba, though I still felt her gaze upon me. As I turned to follow the direction she had indicated, down the narrow lane between the sagging houses, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. Another figure emerged from behind a nearby izba, heavily cloaked in dark, rough fabric, their face completely hidden within the shadows of their hood. It didn't approach, just stood there at the edge of the lane, utterly still, watching me. Then another figure appeared further down the lane, near what looked like a communal well. And another, standing guard by a dark, snow-covered barn. Silent, still observers, melting into the shadows and the falling snow, yet radiating an unmistakable presence. It wasn't just the old woman, the whole village felt alive in a way that was profoundly wrong, like a disturbed nest of unseen, dormant things. I began to walk, forcing myself to place one foot in front of the other, resisting the desperate urge to turn and run back the way I came, back into the empty, forgiving wilderness. My boots crunched loudly on the crisp snow, the only sound in the oppressive, watchful silence. I kept glancing back over my shoulder. The old woman was no longer visible in the doorway, but I knew she was there, still watching. The figures were still there, dotted along the lane like morbid sentinels, their stillness more terrifying than any overt threat. I reached a small, irregular snow-covered square in the heart of the village. In the center stood a dark, misshapen structure, perhaps a shrine, perhaps a communal storage building, or something else entirely. And clustered around it were more figures, standing unnaturally still, facing inwards towards the structure. As I drew closer, my heart hammering against my ribs like a drum, I could see they weren't just standing. They seemed to be swaying slightly, a slow, unnatural rhythm, barely perceptible but deeply disturbing. And from the structure itself, a low, resonant hum began to emanate, a sound that didn't just reach my ears but seemed to vibrate in the very air around me, in my bones, deep within my chest. The smell of damp earth and something metallic was stronger here, mixed with an acrid, unfamiliar scent I couldn't place, something bitter and organic. I stopped dead, rooted to the spot, my breath pluming white in the frigid air, every instinct screaming at me to flee. I was surrounded by silent watchers and drawn towards a humming, unseen horror at the center of this dead village. The gate creaked shut behind me, plunging the courtyard into a sudden, oppressive silence, the only sound the distant, mournful cry of an unfamiliar bird. My hand was still raised, half reaching for the heavy wood that had just sealed my exit. A shiver, unconnected to the cooling evening air, traced a path down my spine. The bird cry, which had seemed merely melancholic from a distance, now felt like a direct, sorrowful lament coming from somewhere just beyond the high stone walls. I turned, my heart giving a little lurch against my ribs. The courtyard, which had held a fading, quiet beauty in the twilight, now felt utterly alien. The gray stones underfoot seemed to absorb the last vestiges of light. The ancient moss-covered stone lanterns lining the path to the main temple buildings were dark, their unlit eyes staring blankly into the gloom. Towering cedar trees on the periphery of the compound rustled faintly, a sound that felt less like wind and more like hushed whispers exchanging secrets about the intruder in their midst. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of my composure. I hadn't intended to stay this late. The elderly caretaker, his face a roadmap of ancient wrinkles and his eyes holding an unsettling, knowing glint, had merely gestured vaguely when I'd asked about closing time. Until the darkness arrives, he'd murmured in broken English, before shuffling back into his small, cluttered office filled with dusty scrolls and the faint scent of incense and something else, something metallic and earthy. I hadn't understood it as a literal instruction or a warning. I'd been too absorbed in sketching the intricate carvings on the main hall doors. Now, the darkness was not just arriving, it had claimed this place entirely. I fumbled for my phone, the screen a feeble, useless beacon against the encroaching blackness. No signal. Of course. The caretaker had mentioned the remoteness, but I hadn't grasped this level of isolation. I tried the heavy gate again, shoving at it with my shoulder. It didn't budge. The wood felt rough and old beneath my palms, solid and final. It wasn't just closed, it felt sealed, locked by some unseen mechanism or perhaps just its own immense age and weight. My breath hitched. Okay. Don't panic. There must be another way out. A service entrance, a smaller side gate. I needed to think clearly. I shone my phone's light hesitantly down the path leading towards the main temple building. The path was paved with smooth, worn stones, flanked by the dark, silent lanterns. To the left, the silhouette of a smaller building, perhaps a storehouse or a secondary shrine, loomed under the cedars. To the right, the courtyard opened up into a larger, less defined area that seemed to lead deeper into the complex. I decided to head towards the main building. It was the most imposing structure. Maybe there would be a caretaker's residence attached, or a door that wasn't the main entrance. My footsteps on the stone sounded unnaturally loud in the profound silence, a rhythmic crunch that seemed to echo back at me from the dark facades of the buildings. Every few steps, I stopped, straining my ears. Was that just the wind in the trees, or something else? A rustle that was too low to be leaves, too deliberate? As I drew closer to the main hall, the air grew colder, and a faint, cloying scent reached me, not the expected incense, but something sweeter, heavier, like decaying flowers mixed with damp earth. The main hall itself was a massive, dark shape against the bruised twilight sky. Its elaborate roof curved upwards, topped with dark, angular tiles that seemed to claw at the last light. The heavy wooden doors were closed, indistinguishable from the surrounding wall in the near-total darkness. I raised my phone's light again, sweeping it over the facade. The carvings I had admired earlier were now grotesque in the shifting light and shadows. Faces seemed to twist, benevolent figures taking on malevolent grins. My light caught something else near the base of the wall, tucked between two mossy stones. A small, woven straw doll, its form crude and unsettlingly humanoid, lay half buried in the damp earth. It looked old, weathered, and somehow deeply unhappy. I recoiled instinctively, a wave of revulsion washing over me. It felt like something left deliberately, not lost by accident. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the dark building. The silence was no longer just oppressive, it felt expectant, as if the air itself was holding its breath. That distant bird cry had ceased. Now, the only sounds were my own ragged breathing and the distant, almost imperceptible groaning of the old wood of the temple building, settling in the night or perhaps under some unseen weight. Then I heard it. Distinct. Not a rustle of leaves, not the settling wood. A soft, scuffing sound on the stone path behind me, towards the direction of the gate. Like a sandal dragging lightly. My heart leaped into my throat. I froze, every muscle tense. I held my breath, listening, straining to hear it again over the frantic drumming in my ears. Silence. Had I imagined it? The tension was playing tricks on me. I told myself it was just my own foot shifting on the stone. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Not one scuff, but two, three, a hesitant, shuffling gait. Someone was in the courtyard with me. I spun around, pointing my phone's light, my hand trembling so violently the beam danced wildly across the empty space. Nothing. Just the silent stone lanterns and the path stretching back into the deeper darkness towards the gate. Yet the sound had been undeniable. It hadn't been loud, almost unnervingly quiet, but it had been there. And it was moving. I took a step back, then another, retreating towards the main temple building, seeking the perceived safety of its solid walls, even though the straw doll lay near its base like a macabre warning. My eyes darted frantically into the shadows pooling around the trees and buildings. The air grew colder still, and the cloying sweet smell intensified, making me feel nauseous. A low whisper reached me, carried on the breeze that wasn't there. It wasn't in English or Japanese, or any language I recognized. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone, a sibilant, unintelligible murmur that seemed to coil around me. It was close. Too close. I stifled a cry, pressing myself against the rough wood of the temple wall. My phone's light flickered, its battery draining faster than I expected. In the periphery of its weak beam, a shape detached itself from the deeper shadow beneath a cedar tree. It was indistinct, too tall and thin, like a column of smoke-given substance. It didn't seem to have legs, but it glided, smoothly, silently, towards the edge of the courtyard. It wasn't moving quickly, but its trajectory was clear. It was moving in a wide arc, as if to circle behind me, to cut off my only remaining option, which was to run blindly deeper into the complex. The whisper came again, clearer this time, right beside my ear, and felt like icy breath on my skin. I wasn't just trapped. I was being stalked. The whisper wasn't loud, more like a breath of cold air shaped into sound, brushing against her earlobe. It spoke a single word she didn't recognize, thick with rustling consonants and a drawn-out vowel, like wind sighing through dry leaves. A shudder ran down Anya's spine, electric and cold. She snatched her hand back from the box as if burned, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her breath hitched in her throat. Silence fell back into the room, heavier now, pressing in from the walls. The air tasted metallic and stale. Anya stood frozen for a long moment, her eyes wide and fixed on the small wooden box on the dusty floorboards. Had she imagined it? Fatigue, stress, the unnerving silence of the old house coupled with her isolation in this strange village, it was easy to conjure things out of nothing. Yes, that must be it. A trick of the mind, a rustle of wind outside finding its way in. Slowly, her heartbeat began to settle from its frantic rhythm, though a residual tremor lingered in her hands. She forced herself to crouch back down, moving cautiously as if the box might spring open and reveal something monstrous. It was just a box. Old wood, crudely carved. Inside, a piece of faded cloth and a dead flower. Nothing more. The whisper, it was nothing. She leaned closer again, but did not touch this time. The box was small, perhaps no bigger than her palm. The wood was dark, almost black with age, and felt strangely cool to the touch even from a distance. Intricate carvings covered its surface, not decorative patterns she recognized, but angular, almost knot-like shapes that seemed to write the longer she looked at them. On the scrap of cloth lay the flower, dry and brittle, its petals curled inwards like tiny, withered claws. It was a dull, unpleasant brown, mottled with darker spots. The cloth itself was rough, homespun linen, a faded grayish-white. And on it, stark and simple, was the symbol. It was drawn or perhaps stitched in a dark, almost black thread. 3 vertical lines, parallel, crossed by a jagged, horizontal line that dipped sharply in the middle. It looked ancient, primitive, utterly alien. Anya felt that same chilling sensation emanate from the symbol, a quiet, oppressive weight that settled in her chest. It wasn't just a symbol, it felt like a brand, a seal. She carefully, using only the tip of her index finger, nudged the corner of the cloth. It felt stiff, almost brittle like the flower. As she disturbed it, a faint, dry scent rose from the box, not the smell of old wood or dust, but something else, something faintly floral yet unsettlingly acrid, like decay masked by cheap perfume. And for a fleeting second, she thought she heard it again, that same rustling whisper, softer this time, like paper being crumpled far away. This time, she didn't try to rationalize it away. Her stomach twisted with a cold, sharp fear. This wasn't her imagination. Something about this box, about these objects, was deeply wrong. They felt steeped in something old and dark, something that permeated the very air around them. She had to know what the symbol meant. Her small collection of travel books and phrase books wouldn't help with this. It was clearly a local thing, maybe specific to this valley or even this village. Her first instinct was to get rid of it, to bury the box back under the floorboards or, better yet, throw it into the deep, fast-flowing river she'd seen on the edge of the village. But a perverse, horrifying curiosity held her back. She needed answers. The house felt different now. Every creak of the old timbers was a potential footstep. Every gust of wind rattling the windowpanes sounded like fingers scraping. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, pooling like black ink. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the discovery of the box had somehow alerted something to her presence. She needed to get out, even just for a short while. Maybe one of the older villagers, the ones who seemed to hold themselves apart from the younger generation, might know something. There was an old woman Anya had seen sitting outside her tiny cottage near the church, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and observant. People seemed to give her a wide berth, speaking her name, Baba Yeva, with a mix of reverence and caution. Perhaps she knew the old ways. Clutching the image of the symbol in her mind, Anya carefully closed the box, though it felt wrong, like sealing something in that wanted to get out. She tucked it deep into the floor cavity and replaced the loose board, pushing the threadbare rug back over it. The space beneath the rug suddenly felt like a dark, breathing mouth. Stepping outside into the pale afternoon light was a small relief, yet the feeling of being watched persisted. It wasn't coming from the house anymore, it felt like it was following her. As she walked the narrow, muddy track towards the village center, the few villagers she passed seemed to pause their tasks, their eyes tracking her until she was out of sight. Their usual wary curiosity felt tinged with something else today, something harder to define. A sort of expectant stillness, as if waiting to see what she would do. Baba Yeva's cottage was even smaller up close, nestled beneath the drooping branches of a gnarled apple tree. A faint smell of wood smoke and dried herbs hung in the air. The door was ajar. Anya hesitated for a moment, then rapped lightly on the frame. There was no answer, but a low shuffling sound came from within. Anya pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. The room was dim, cluttered with bundles of drying plants hanging from the low ceiling, strange jars and bottles lining shelves, and a small, smoldering fire in the hearth. In a worn armchair by the fire sat Baba Yeva, her hands gnarled roots resting in her lap, her eyes closed. "Baba Yeva?" Anya said softly, her voice feeling loud in the quiet room. The old woman's eyes snapped open. They were a startlingly pale blue, ancient and piercing. She didn't speak immediately, just studied Anya's face with an unnerving intensity. A slow smile spread across her lips, revealing gums mostly devoid of teeth. It wasn't a warm smile. "The foreigner," Baba Yeva rasped, her voice like dry leaves skittering on stone. "You come seeking. What is it you seek in this place?" Anya stepped fully into the cottage, the air thick with unfamiliar scents. I found something. An object. With a symbol on it. I hoped you might know what it is." She tried to draw the symbol in the dust on the floor with her finger, but Baba Yeva stopped her with a sharp, guttural sound. "Not here. Do not draw it here." The old woman's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of fear crossing her otherwise impassive face. "Describe it, if you must. But do not give it form in my home." Anya hesitated, unnerved by the reaction. She described the box, the cloth, the dried flower, and then, carefully, the symbol, the 3 vertical lines, the jagged horizontal crossing them. As she spoke, Baba Yeva's face grew pale. She clutched the arms of her chair, her knuckles turning white. When Anya finished, the old woman was trembling. She mumbled something in the local language that Anya couldn't understand, but the tone was full of dread. You found this?" Baba Yeva whispered, her gaze fixed on Anya as if she saw a ghost standing behind her. "Where? Tell me where you found it." Anya hesitated, reluctant to reveal the hidden space in the house. "In the old house I am staying in. Hidden away." Baba Yeva closed her eyes for a moment, taking a shaky breath. When she opened them again, the sharp fear was still there, but tempered with a grim resignation. "That symbol, the box, it is old, foreigner. Very old. It is a binding. A cage." She paused, licking her dry lips. "And the flower, it is from the earth that feeds on sorrow." Anya's blood ran cold. "A cage? For what?" Baba Yeva leaned forward conspiratorially, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "For something that does not belong. Something trapped long ago. It hungers. It waits." She pointed a trembling finger at Anya. "You have disturbed it. You have heard its voice, yes? It knows you found the key." Anya felt a wave of nausea. The whisper. "The key? The box isn't a key. The box is the cage," Baba Yeva corrected, her voice laced with urgency. "The symbol is the lock. And the foreigner, the one who touches it, that is the unintended key." Her eyes were wide with a terror that mirrored Anya's own burgeoning dread. "You must put it back," the old woman urged, her voice hoarse. "Put it back exactly as you found it. And never, ever, open it again. If you break the lock, if you let it out?" She didn't finish the sentence, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. She was looking past Anya, towards the doorway, towards the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows through the trees. Her gaze was fixed on something Anya couldn't see, her face a mask of horror. The feeling of being watched intensified, now feeling predatory, ancient, and very, very close. David pressed himself against the cold, rough stone, the scent of damp earth and unseen decay filling his nostrils. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt deafening in the oppressive silence that had fallen after the low, guttural chant ceased. It had come from the dense blackness beyond the village perimeter, a sound that clawed at something primal deep within him. The old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles and fear, had warned him. Not directly, not clearly, but in hushed whispers and meaningful glances towards the encroaching forest after the sun had dipped below the horizon. "The place outside," she'd murmured, her eyes wide, "not for strangers. Not after dark. The hungry spirits walk." That sound, that terrible, rasping chant, felt undeniably tied to her fragmented warnings. It was a sound that spoke of something ancient, demanding, and deeply wrong. The darkness was absolute just beyond the crumbling wall he hid behind. The few scattered lights of the village, warm and inviting in their distance, seemed impossibly far away now, fragile beacons against the overwhelming void. The air felt heavier here, colder, carrying a faint, acrid smell he couldn't quite place, like stagnant water mixed with something metallic, something animal. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a twig in the forest, was amplified, sending jolts of fear through him. His breath hitched in his throat, shallow and ragged. He willed himself to be silent, invisible, to somehow merge with the ancient stone and the shadows clinging to it. His muscles ached from tension, coiled tight as if ready to spring, though he had nowhere to run that didn't involve plunging further into the darkness from which the sound had emanated. He replayed the old woman's words in his mind. She had offered him a small, dried flower and a piece of string before he'd ventured out of the guest house earlier that day, pressing them into his hand with surprising force. "Keep it close," she'd urged, her voice barely a whisper. "Respect the land. Do not disturb the resting. Listen." He hadn't understood the full weight of her fear then. He'd thought it quaint superstition, charming local color for his research notes. Now, huddled in the freezing dark, with that unnerving chant still echoing in his mind's ear, he felt the chill of genuine terror, a creeping dread that went deeper than simple fear of the unknown. This felt malevolent, purposeful. Despite the paralyzing fear, a morbid, foolish curiosity began to assert itself. He had come here to study the local beliefs, the remnants of animism and spirit worship intertwined with the more formal religions. He was a researcher, wasn't he? Wasn't this, whatever this was, a manifestation of those beliefs? He had to see. He had to know. Ignoring the screaming protest of his instincts, he slowly, cautiously, raised his head just enough to peer over the top of the wall. The darkness was a solid curtain. He strained his eyes, trying to pierce the gloom. At first, he saw nothing but the endless blackness of the forest floor meeting the slightly less dark expanse of the night sky. Then, a faint, flickering light. And another. Small, unsteady pinpricks of yellow against the black. They were moving, slowly, deliberately, perhaps 100 yards out from the wall, just inside the tree line. As he watched the lights, the air grew colder still. A low murmur began, distinct from the previous chant but equally unsettling. It sounded like hushed voices, too far away to distinguish words, but their tone was low, resonant, almost guttural. The flickering lights resolved into what looked like small torches or lamps held low to the ground. And beneath them, indistinct shapes. Figures. They were dark against the darkness, hunched or cloaked, moving with a strange, shuffling gait. They weren't walking like normal people. They seemed to glide, or perhaps their feet were obscured by the brush and the angle. There were maybe 4 or 5 of them gathered around something on the ground, just visible in the faint light of their torches. The low murmur intensified, joined by other sounds, a soft scraping, a muffled thud, a low, almost mournful sigh that seemed to carry on the unnaturally cold breeze. They were doing something to the ground. Digging? Or placing something? As one of the figures shifted, the light from their torch caught something briefly, a flash of polished wood, maybe? It looked like a small, crude altar, but lower, closer to the earth than the spirit houses he'd seen in the village. They were gathered around this focal point, their movements slow, ritualistic. This wasn't a simple prayer or offering like the bowls of rice and flowers left at the village shrines. This felt heavier, darker. The air around them seemed to shimmer slightly in the dim light, a distortion that made his eyes ache. Then, one of the figures stopped moving. It wasn't facing the altar like the others. It was facing him. Or at least, facing in the general direction of the wall. Even in the poor light, David felt the uncanny certainty that its attention had shifted. He froze, every muscle locked. He couldn't see its face, not clearly, but the outline of its head was turned towards him. The low murmur of the other figures continued, oblivious, or perhaps uncaring. The figure remained still for an agonizingly long moment, a dark statue carved from the night itself. And then, slowly, deliberately, it began to move. Not towards the altar, but towards the crumbling stone wall where he was hiding. It didn't break into a run, didn't even hurry. It moved with that same strange, shuffling glide, silent and relentless, closing the distance between the tree line and the village perimeter. Each step was deliberate, each silent movement a hammer blow against David's fraying composure. Panic flared hot and sharp in his chest. It knew. Somehow, it knew he was there. Alex stared down at the small, dark piece of wood on his pillow. It was perhaps no longer than his hand, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and knot into each other. The wood was impossibly dark, almost black, and felt heavy in his hand, surprisingly dense for its size. As he picked it up, a low, rhythmic drumming began somewhere out in the oppressive jungle night. The sound was faint at first, a dull, steady thudding that seemed to resonate not just in the air but in the very ground beneath the old guest house. Boom boom, boom boom, steady, relentless. It wasn't the sound of rain, which often hammered against the corrugated roof, nor was it the chirping chorus of cicadas or the rustling of leaves. This was deliberate, artificial, yet it held a primal, almost organic quality. Alex turned the wooden figure over in his hand. The carvings were deep, almost violent, depicting intertwined shapes that could be roots, serpents, or something else entirely. There were no eyes, no mouth, just this intricate network of lines. It felt cool to the touch, despite the stifling humidity of the room. How had it gotten there? The door had been locked, or at least, he had locked it. Had someone been in the room? While he was at dinner? The thought sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. He walked to the window, the wooden effigy still clutched in his hand. The glass was fogged with condensation, and he wiped a patch clear with his sleeve. Outside, the darkness was absolute, thick and velvety. The jungle pressed in on all sides, a solid wall of black against the barely visible, starless sky. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying vegetation, and something else he couldn't quite place, perhaps the cloying sweetness of night-blooming flowers, or something more unsettling, like stale blood. The drumming continued, seeming to emanate from somewhere deeper within the tangled mass of trees, maybe 50 meters away, maybe 500. It was impossible to tell in the heavy air. Boom boom, boom boom. It wasn't fast, nor particularly loud, but its sheer persistence was unnerving. It felt like a pulse, the slow, steady heartbeat of the jungle itself. Alex tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a local ceremony, a festival he hadn't been told about. This place, nestled deep in the rural interior, was steeped in traditions he barely understood. He had read about animism, about spirits residing in trees and rivers, about offerings made to appease ancient powers. Was this drumming part of something like that? And if so, why the effigy? And why on his pillow? He looked down at the figure again. It didn't feel like a friendly offering. It felt watchful, malevolent. He had seen carvings in the local market, tourist trinkets, but nothing like this. This piece felt old, significant, carrying a weight that went beyond its physical form. A floorboard creaked somewhere above him, in the empty room on the second floor. He froze, straining to listen over the persistent drumming. There it was again, a faint scrape, like something being dragged slowly across the rough wooden floor. The guest house was supposed to be empty save for him and the quiet couple who ran it, who slept in a separate annex. He was alone in this main building. He backed away from the window, his heart pounding a frantic counter-rhythm to the drumming outside. His eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the noise upstairs, for any sign that someone or something else was here. The room was simple, a bed, a wardrobe, a small table, a single flickering fluorescent light overhead casting long, dancing shadows. Everything seemed normal, yet the air felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. The drumming outside seemed to subtly increase in intensity, its beat becoming slightly more insistent. Boom boom boom, boom boom boom. It wasn't getting faster, but it felt like it was swelling, filling the space, pressing against the walls of the guest house. He needed to get rid of the effigy. It felt like the source of the unease, a focal point. He walked over to the bin by the table and raised his hand to drop it in. As he did, a sudden, chilling draft swept through the room, despite the windows and door being closed. It carried the scent of damp earth and something else, something like stagnant water and decay. The fluorescent light flickered violently, threatening to extinguish entirely. He hesitated, the effigy poised over the bin. The drumming outside seemed to pause for a beat, just one beat, before resuming, now sounding impossibly closer, perhaps just outside the guesthouse walls, right at the edge of the clearing. And then, accompanying the drums, he heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a whisper that was also a growl, foreign and utterly terrifying, swirling just beyond the thin wall separating him from the jungle night. He felt a wave of primal dread wash over him, the certainty settling deep in his bones that he was not alone, and whatever was out there, summoned by the drumming and perhaps drawn by this strange effigy, knew he was here.